So again, I am just so happy to be here with two wonderful spirits, two great people that I've had the opportunity to know for greater than 15 years. And as I've continued to be on my evolution, it's been interesting to watch them on parallel paths. And, I consider all of us to be seekers in the world and trying to find out what's really true and what inspires us and what's, how do we bring our greatest gifts to the world? So I'm here with Jodi and Kerry Perl, and just thrilled to have them here today. And what we're going to do, again, reminding the audience that what we're doing is looking at really interesting lives and some of the pivot points, the important decisions that have been made, the actions that have been taken, and then reflecting on how do the concepts that are embedded inside the Prism of Perspective, really, how did they motivate those actions? How did they inspire those actions? So we kind of get an idea of how you in the audience can use this in your own life, right? Because the purpose of this is to have an opportunity to explore how other people are making decisions, how they're energizing their lives, how they're staying present, so that you can take that information and use it for yourself. So because we're here today and as a couple, what I thought might be an interesting place to start is really looking at your relationship and kind of going back in time, because I've known you both for a long time, and I've done work with a lot of different couples and things along those lines. And a lot of times people are, we may get attached to the idea, like I was married forever, right? I got married. It was a commitment. I knew this was a thing. And no matter what's going on, I'm staying in that place. And my experience of having worked with a lot of people is, a lot of times that's absolutely the right choice. And no one is here talking about the idea that if there's, a bump in the road or a little bit of a difference, that we walk away from our commitment. But what I also think is true is that we also have to stay present to the idea that sometimes both parties benefit when there's a separation and there's a new direction and there's a reconnection. And I know that you guys have an experience with that. So I thought maybe we could start there, make it fun. So who wants to dive in on that one?
dive right into the deep well.
Dive right in, right?
Jodi, would you like to start with that?
I think I can speak for both Kerry and I that neither of us were planning on leaving our former relationships in meeting each other. And there was a lot of time spent in very, very deep reflection about the choice to stay in our former commitments or to create something new. We were not moving into something blindly or in following any kind of impulse of the flesh, I'll say.
Right.
There was a lot of cognizant presence in everything from the first conversation we had, being completely forthright and transparent with our former partners from the very first time we had a conversation. We both went home that evening and shared with our former partners that there was a conversation that was had that was significant. Is that fair to say?
I think so. That's very fair to say. It's becoming more and more significant all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's never ended. Right.
Yeah.
And it's expanded to include our partners, our families.
Right. That was something you shared with me just Kerry and I had an opportunity to have some breakfast the other day. And one of the things I thought was really cool, talking about your Father's Day experience. Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah. It was a bucket list day for me, John. It was my ex-wife and her husband and all our children and my mother, the mother-in-law, and my wife were all together. And, that was in our new home we call the Love Shack, and it's been a magnet for healing, it seems. And to have my entire family show up there on Father's Day.
Which was actually initiated by his ex-wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
Her idea for us to all get together to celebrate.
Yeah.
Go wit.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was powerful. And for my mother who has, effectively been, felt like she was sidelined as the matriarch, in my family for 20 years, because of time and distance and the reformation of the relationships, for her was just a beautiful thing. And it was just heartwarming for me to watch.
Right.
And so I was just a day filled with tremendous gratitude and laughs and each time less and less alcohol. So when we first started getting together, it helped.
So let's kind of look at this from a beliefs perspective, right? Because a lot of times when, people talk about that and it's almost as if that's not a possibility, right? Well, that can never happen. That's not even within the realm of possibility, that you can have a separation and that you can come together and that both people can actually be thrilled and joyous in their own particular journeys and come together and share love. And so let's talk about when you first had your relationship, or the beginning of the dissolution of the relationship you had. What were some of the beliefs that might have been expressed at that time, and how have you seen those evolve? Like, what are the beliefs that might have been expressed as it relates to what's possible inside relationships versus what you're experiencing today?
Well, I'll say for me, there was a tremendous amount of guilt, shame, fear surrounding, what was intuitively feeling and from my heart feeling like the right choice for me in my life, and all the collateral, effects and vibrations that created. And so my belief system was, I'm never going to get divorced. I'm not that guy. I come from a long chain of divorces. My family looks like a family bush rather than a tree. And I'm going to be the first guy in my marriage in my family history to stay together. And, at that point in my life, I had checked a lot of the proverbial boxes I created for myself, the career, some financial abundance, the white picket fence, the 2.5 kids and 2 dogs, and, the whole, the dream that I thought I was ready for or wanted, or, I created.
Yeah. It kind of shook that snow globe a little bit, huh?
To its foundation. And so looking at that made me question everything I ever believed about myself. And I had to do so much work inside of that paradigm to, kind of shift it for myself and dig out of that hole, because it wasn't going to serve anybody ultimately.
Right.
The guilt, the fear, the shame,
right.
All those things, for me to tuck tail and be that man, ultimately was not a draft
right
for the rest of my family. And I didn't realize, that it's really more about the draft and who you're becoming,
right,
that becomes those around you,
right,
or facilitates the becoming of those around you. And I had so much work to do.
Right.
And it was,
which makes it fun, right? I mean, the journey's the whole thing, right? And we sit here today and can look back. I think, we can look back at the times, 15 years ago or whatever times we've made different decisions or where we were, and think, wow, look at the evolution. And then realize it's accelerating, right? It's an accelerating pace. And, one of the ways I look at human evolution, like our own individual human evolution, as part of the universe, right? Because everything continues to expand. And so why would we not continue to expand, right? What about us, right? What about us would keep us from expanding, except our attachment to holding ourselves into this smaller life, right?
Or the hologram you're creating, what's the paradigm through which you're seeing the world, that's creating the world you're living in at the same time, and not being separate from it, being lost in that story.
Right. Which is totally the whole belief side of the prism of perspective, right? The idea that, we see the world not as it is, but as we are, right? We experience the world, right? Seeing is a sensory expression, but we really experience the world as we are. And it's a lot of that's based on, who do we think we are? What is the identity belief, like you said, that you had about yourself? I'm this guy and this is who I am. And then all of a sudden, if we get so attached to that, and we're unwilling to really be fluid and aware and follow the energy, then we can end up, sacrificing what's possible for ourselves and others. Right? I mean, even if we sit here today and look at it, your ex and her husband, that great relationship, that wouldn't be here, right? So all of the different things that happen and are made possible by when we pay attention, right? And that doesn't mean every decision that we make is always the right one, but it's being open and allowing things to evolve and not being so constrained. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The language I've heard around it is when you resist or you're unaware, you're contracted.
Right.
And when you're contracted, you're stifling energy. You're not allowing flow state. You're not allowing the natural current of things to evolve and expand because you're restricting and contracting and holding on to.
Yeah. In some ways trying to stay small, right? You may not say it that way, but the status quo is not growing, right? The status quo by definition is fixed. And so, a lot of what we talk about in our evolution is, how do you understand the idea between a fixed and a growth mindset, right? A fixed mindset is really the idea that this is all static, right? That we are as we are, that, and a growth mindset, one, means that we can continue to grow and evolve and learn and develop. And so there is no limit. And when that gives us the opportunity to really open into that big, big space, right?
100%.
So I love that we had an opportunity to dive there. I want to go into some other areas as well. And I want to actually address this one to Jodi, because I know you had a big event in your late teens that had to change the way you see the world. And that was that you were involved with a very critical accident. Yes. And so let's talk about what was some of the beliefs that you had prior to, and how did you come out of that? And what was going on for you?
So I was 17 years old, and I wouldn't say I came from a religious household, but my mother was a very spiritual, a seeker. Uh-huh. And she had introduced me to a lot of that kind of thinking and mindset. And in my car accident, not to get too granular into the details, but I was tossed out of the car. The car rolled 3 times, and the car landed on top of me on its wheels. And I never lost consciousness in this, just the moment of when the whole thing happened. But I was awake from the time it ended. And I was underneath the car, trapped, barely able to breathe, really, for about an hour before help came. So I had a very unique and intense hour to be basically facing mortality at 17 years old in the matter of a second. 1 minute you're on your way home, and the next minute you're not sure you're going to see your family again. And so much came through me and came at me during that time, because it was, I really got a kind of a macro view of the power of the mind because of the situation I was in. Not being able to really breathe, I was really crushed into the ground. So I had to remain calm enough to maintain my breath, to be able to remain consciousness. And you get a crazy lucid awareness in situations like this. And even at 17, I knew where I was. I knew all the things were going through my head. Is my car going to catch on fire? I can't breathe. It's dark where I am. Nobody's going to see my car until morning. I can't continue to breathe like this. And
you're alone at this time.
And I'm alone at this time. So I had to, in order to survive, weed through that noise of the mind that was in survival and absolute fear and panic.
Right.
And I had to find a calm space and basically create the reality around me that no matter what happened, I was going to be,
Right.
I was waiting. Was I going to see a light? Was there going to be a tunnel? Was there, were angels going to surround me? Nothing like that happened. It was just complete blackness. I was looking up at the bottom of my car. Complete pitch blackness and silence and nobody around. And at 17 had to navigate that situation for that amount of time.
Did you have a good meditation practice at the time?
I wouldn't say a meditation practice, but I had a lot of deep belief in kind of, and just understanding that you will never die. You will pass from your body. And I was dealing with that. Certainly I was dealing with the fear of never seeing my family, and was this going to really be the end? And, all of that. But I was also, there was some other aspect or essence that kicked in that was like my higher self,
Right. Knowing that regardless, the spirit that was you was going to be okay. The physical body may or may not make it out of here.
Right.
Right.
But it's a unique experience to be able to be that close to, I guess, the doorway.
Right.
And not pass through it, and to watch what comes through the mind in that situation.
So I want to think about the idea of near-death experience, which I don't have any experience with, and kind of the ideas of what happens in flow states, right? So where time dilates and everything seems kind of weird. So you were in that space. Did the hour move quickly? Did it move really slowly? Like, did the car wreck, like as you're rolling? Do you remember that?
I do. The rolling especially. That felt like slow motion. I remember the coins falling from my tray, and I remember the glass shattering and breaking in, and I remember the swirling feeling.
Right.
Very slow motion, and to the point where it was some time after the accident that if I even drove by another car accident, I would be completely right back to it.
Right.
So that was slow motion, and then I would say the actual time underneath the car just felt like one moment. Okay. Like one pause.
Yep.
I was just in one moment.
You were just kind of there, very present, and recognize that you had to stay super calm. And so I think that's a really neat way that we can look at time, right? Because so often many people have a perception, that time does have a linear aspect to it, but that's not the only aspect. And the way we experience whatever we experience has a lot to do with the intensity of whatever's going on. And when you look at, okay, so you're seeing this move in slow motion, and it, again, memories are embedded when there's high emotion. So you have this high emotional state where you're not your freeze framing, but the number of frames per second is just radically enhanced, right? So in a movie, it's, 16 frames, but you might have had 1,000 frames, each of which you had an opportunity to really experience in that slowed down, kind of interesting, right? Very interesting.
Yeah.
Hyper presence.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, when we look at that, I think that it gives us an opportunity to challenge the standard perceptions of time and what's really possible and what time frames, and right, because it really depends on how we're engaged in that space.
It's such a, to me, it opens the door on the conversation about presence, because inside of pure presence, time is bent.
Right.
And, it's that thing you're doing that if you're in flow state, otherwise said as a hyper presence.
Right.
Super challenging situations, emergencies pull you into hyper presence. Sometimes super joyous ones do, super, sad and tragic ones do. I mean, I remember a time in my life where, my wife and I had lost our first child. And I remember walking the dog and looking at the dew on the leaves of the trees, and there was an eerie stillness in the world that was just beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. I just felt like I was stuck in just that moment.
Right.
And to this day, I can see that dew on that leaf. Right. I know where I was standing on that sidewalk,
Again, thinking about how memories are really embedded and the way we reflect on life is as we become more present. This is the thing that I think is so much fun, right? As we continue to become more present, our experiences are so much richer that they're, from my experience, seems to be much more embedded in memory with clarity and, vivid color and, great sound, everything that you can go back to that space when we're present. And in times where you're really kind of distracted, like nothing is embedded. Somebody's like, well, do you remember that? If you weren't really there, the memory's actually not there. We don't have this, recall like it's a movie screen that we go back to. The truth is that, emotions, neurochemicals deepen a memory and embed it somewhere. But there has to be something there that's kind of going on. So thank you for sharing that very personal story, and quite harrowing, I would imagine, even to just kind of go back in your mind.
Yeah, a little, but it really is something that I feel was probably one of the biggest gifts of shaping my character. You know,
Right.
one of the most outstanding events that I have experienced.
What was a catalyst for the spiritual journey?
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's tough to deny our mortality when you look it in the face like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not many 17-year-olds do, right?
Yeah, and then as you're saying, the texture and the richness and the quality of presence and awareness for the gift of life after that, at that age.
Right. Pretty spectacular, huh?
Pretty spectacular.
So another area that we'll kind of dive into. So you guys don't know these two wonderful people yet. So they're both great yogis, have been in their yoga practices for a long time. So from an energetic perspective, from a physical energetic perspective, right? Because we do come through that physical space. Tell me a little more about how that's continued to evolve for both of you, because I know you've been in that journey for quite some time. In fact, Kerry invited to me his yoga class on Saturday. I think I'll make it this next one.
Yeah, awesome. Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much yoga. Okay. Well, yoga hooked me by the ego, and then it's been deconstructing it ever since.
That's a cool way to say it. I think I'm with you completely. Describe a little more what you mean by that.
Yeah. So for me, I was, I grew up as an athlete, and it was a kind of a bigger, faster, stronger guy. College football and, military school, and, growing up with, my father figures were coaches and my mother's boyfriends and stepfather and father, and to whatever degree, it was like a mishmash of male archetypes. A
lot of alpha running around, huh?
A lot of that. And so after I was done with college, and I was like not a football player anymore. It was Kerry Perl, the football player. And then I was like, well, what, how does that segue? And I was in the gym doing what I do, and a yoga teacher, I was intrigued by yoga because I had developed a meditation practice, and I saw them as co-joined, and I got challenged to take this, Bikram hot yoga class. And I went into the class, and within the first 15, 20 minutes of the class, I was down on the floor. I was gassed. I was huffing and puffing, and I was like, this is one of the hardest things I've done in a long time. And I look around the room, and there's, all these mostly women in there, and they're all like legs out to here, legs up here, behind the head. It was like that they were killing this class. And I was like, I got to conquer this class. I got to figure this out. I came back, and it
sounds like what you're saying at the beginning, it's really an ego thing, right?
It was an ego. It hooked me by, I have to conquer this, and I think this particular lineage of yoga is fairly intense, and it's hot, and it's, so it draws that A-type personality.
Yep.
But then, and you're looking in the mirror while you're doing this, so you're everything that comes up about you and your own, the separate self's judgment of you. That small s is right there in your face. And,
all your imperfections, right? You could be like looking beautiful, and you're like, well, look at that one spot.
And if you're not aware of the observer, if you're not, at the place where you are actually, in the practice of observing your mind and the conversations that are going on in your head, the discursive chatter, then you get lost in it, right? You're down those rabbit trails, and you wake up with bad decisions or repercussions that you don't want necessarily, right? Or you create a life that's built on a false sense of who you are. It's inauthentic.
I don't even know if you know this. I don't know if we've ever had this conversation, but before we ever knew each other, I was at Oxygen, and so were you. Yeah. And we were in the locker room. Did we have this conversation before? I don't remember. So. I don't know. But we were in the locker room, and I come out of a high intensity strength training background, and so from my perspective, that was always the most effective form of exercise. It does a lot of stuff, and we were in the locker room, and we were both getting dressed, and I don't exactly remember their words, but you said something along the lines like, oh, if you want to do the best workout in the world, or whatever it was, something in that ballpark. And so that was about all we had there. And then I think I remember seeing you, you were playing with your kids. So I remembered the person, right? I didn't know you, but I remember the person. I see you playing with your kids. They were young. I think my kids were probably 3 to 5. So yours were in the same ballpark, a little older. And we were at remember that little pirate place where at Juno Beach, they were going up and down the stairs or anything. I was like, oh, that's the guy from the yoga thing. And then we met you a little bit later than that. So it was kind of interesting. And at the time I'd never done yoga, and I don't specifically, I kind of have created my own thing, but it's definitely yoga-ish. You know, I may not say it's exactly the same thing, but it's, you know, whatever I do I would not have evolved to what I do had I not been exposed to yoga. I wouldn't have come out of scratch and landed where I've landed, you know? So it's definitely based in a lot of that.
It's integrative.
It's integrative, right? It's very integrative, you know, mind, body, everything. So it's a pretty interesting thing. So it's kind of interesting, the dynamic that I did not know you, and I didn't know you, I think, for a few years after that. Right. So it was, but anyway, I remembered who you were in that space. And Jodi, obviously you've been teaching for quite some time in your own practice, and that's kind of where you guys met, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Where we met.
That's not kind of where you met. That's kind of where, we kind of met there.
That's where he proposed to me. We have a long history in the yoga studio.
I lived in the back of it when I was down and out. Yeah, there's a lot in this yoga space.
Yep.
My story getting connected into the yoga practice, a little different than Kerry's, but I struggled with an eating disorder for a good majority of my younger life, and was really looking to break patterns and feel well. But I remember in the beginning of my yoga practice, it was a feat for me to go and, one, be with myself in the mirror, but also to, I will say, inhabit my body. Because the practice of being in yoga is feeling and experiencing your body in every way. Yep. I mean, macro. So micro, I should say. And I remember having to stand there in the mirror and look at myself and, you know, contract my muscles and bring my legs, my thighs together, and bringing it up for me. I didn't want to feel my body. I didn't want to feel my thighs touching each other. All of that was creating the ghosts I was living with at the time. But the yoga practice really, I faced off with myself for many, 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 many years. In the beginning, it was incredibly healing and therapeutic, and also so challenging to show up on the mat.
So you opened up the idea around your eating disorder, right? And so as an alcoholic, there are different addictions, right? There are different addictions. So tell me a little more about like what you think was going, like what were some of the thoughts that was driving those kind of struggling times for you?
I developed it, I guess, the disordered eating, I like to say. Right around that same kind of puberty time. It was before my car accident, but I remember it being, you know, as I was kind of coming into my own identity. And it, to me, it was all about control and self-discipline for myself. But then as I, in my mind, got better at that behavior, I also got recognized on the outside.
Right.
You know, oh, you're so tiny, you're so little. Are you a zero? Oh my gosh, you know, and it just went from there. And then that just became like I was getting fed from the outside, all these kind of reaffirming what to me felt like love or affection from the outside. I was being noticed, and it ended up being something of a decline, but it felt like it was feeding me. And it was almost like I was in competition with myself because I got better at it. I figured out how to fast longer, how to go without calories. I took it on like a sport, and then that just got me more outward recognition. So it was just a downward spiral of a cycle.
So I'm making this up. I mean, it's not completely from nowhere, because a lot of times disordered eating is kind of described this way. But it sounds like it was a lot about control, but that often comes out of a place of feeling a lack of control. You think about women and their bodies through puberty, and all of a sudden everything 100%. Is changing, and you're feeling like, oh my God, I'm not in control of this.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden you have this one area, you're like, got this.
Yes.
I'm holding on to this.
Yes. I was holding on to it like a wild stallion. I wasn't letting go.
So let's expand that concept, right? And let's think about where else in our lives, maybe when things become disordered, or, you know, there's change, where we might try to hold on to something. And how does that show up? You know, and what are we doing in the present moment to be aware of those times so that we can show up differently. Any thoughts on that?
How long do we have? Well, we are, we have stepped into this space in our current lifestyle, just being we renovated and moved into a new home that is kind of I will just say it was a big step forward in our financial paradigm. Mm-hmm. And kind of right at the same time that we did that, both of our careers shifted. So stepping into a space of unknown and definitely stepping towards what we're creating and stepping towards expansion and growth also feels like you're stepping into the river of change.
Right.
And you're kind of losing that safety, that feeling of safety. And I certainly have felt myself contracting or restricting or grasping, all of the above. And I manage that with myself through my meditation practice.
Right.
Because if I sit and I can get my mind to still, and I can get myself beyond my need for survival, which is the reactive state of being,
yeah.
I can sense the intuition that is actually driving the choices that we are making. And this is the very thing we've been asking for. This is the very thing we have been manifesting that's showing up. But when you step into it, it feels like a whole new paradigm. You can't reach for the straws that have felt like safety in the past.
So I want to hit on a couple of areas and bring it back to the prism of perspective, because there's two places where I think this really crosses. One is the idea of like when we think about energy. And so one of the ways we talk about energy is positive psychology practices and meditation and mindfulness and things along those lines. And so you have the energy piece that you're doing on an ongoing basis as a practice. Mm-hmm. And then you also have the present moment when stuff shows up. And, how do you expand the space between, stimulus and response so you don't find yourself being reactive? So you have the practice. Talk to me about the times where you get triggered in the middle of the day or something happens. Like, how are you finding that mindfulness, or what's working for you?
Well, for me, the practice of Anapana.
Okay.
And Anapana is a very simple meditation technique. It's taught inside of the lineage of Vipassana, which is a meditation technique that was brought down by Gautama Buddha thousands of years ago, and it's a very simple technique in essence. When you go to a retreat, they're typically 10 days long. They're silent. You meditate. You kind of live like a monk. And for the first, and you meditate about
kind of like Kevin Hart in that commercial.
Yeah, kind of like that. And you sit about 10 hours a day. You rise at 4:30 in the morning, 4 in the morning. Eat no food afternoon. It sounds really tough, and it is. But it's broken into hour to 2 hour sits. And for the first 3 days, the only thing that you practice is this technique called Anapana. And Anapana is the focus and awareness of the breath flowing in and out of your nostrils, hitting the space between your upper lip and the bottom of your nose. So essentially your mustache space.
Yep.
And so if you just take a breath, and you can feel that on the hairs beneath your nose, right, John?
Yep.
That's Anapana.
Okay.
And you do that for 3 days, 10 hours a day.
So what I'm hearing so far is really that's a lot of the positive psychology practices, right? So that's what gets you in the space. So how do you use Anapana in the moment, right? Yeah. Something just triggered you. Talk to me about.
Yeah.
So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the breakdown of the way I look at presence, self-awareness, self-control, empathy, and influence. So so in some ways it's self-control, self-awareness, self-control, other awareness, and other influence, right? So that's how in that space we're trying to slow everything down so that we understand what is the environment within which we're living, right? And so all of a sudden something happens, lacking self-awareness, you don't even have a choice to make decisions. But so then now you have self-awareness. Anapana may be a thing that you're saying, and here's how I activate self-control.
Here's how I come back from that.
Okay.
So essentially you're just sharpening a scalpel of your awareness with that practice. And then when I find myself in a situation that appears to come up that's stressful or challenging or challenges the paradigm I'm looking at, or it could be anything.
Triggered.
Thank you. I take a breath.
Mm-hmm.
I stop. And if I can catch that moment,
Right.
I take that breath, I follow that air, and then I have the ability, then I can observe the situation and notice if there's an emotional response rising in me, if it's not already on me.
Right.
Sometimes something happens, it triggers an emotional response. There is no distance between that stimulus and the response. But practicing breathing in the face of a trigger creates distance between stimulus and response.
Is it safe to say that gives you the ability to choose?
It gives you freedom to choose. In the yoga room, it's when you're laying on your back and you're tired. If you feel sweat, you want to scratch it. Take a breath first,
Right.
and then decide if you want to scratch it. Then you've made a conscious decision. I like to say that practice creates a drastic reduction in foot and mouth syndrome.
Yes, it does. So that was great. I love that. And so what I also think I heard is there's almost like we can look at it in some ways. I can go, oh, there's this linear thing, right? Self-awareness, self-control, empathy, influence. But the truth is it cycles for a little bit, right? So you have self-awareness, a little bit of self-control, a little more self-awareness, a little more self-control, until then you're able to say, okay, and now I'm grounded. I've got the space. Now I can observe what else is going on. Who else is here? How are they responding? What is the way that I can then influence and engage? The way I like to think about influence is what I call aligned influence, right? So often people are looking at how we're seeing things differently rather than where can we start with an alignment, right? So when we understand where we are, we understand where they are, then we can say, okay, now I can move from there. But what I hear you saying is what's been very helpful is one, you've done the work, you continue to do the work, whether it's sitting or your long practices of 10-day meditations, but also because you've done that, now you can more easily expand that space. So you can find the presence in the moment when you might ordinarily have gotten triggered. And the other thing I thought was great is sometimes when we get triggered, we are even aware that we're triggered. I'm just going to speak for myself. And sometimes I'm aware that I'm triggered. And I'm like, yeah, I'm still triggered. I'm like, I may not still act in the way that my highest and best self would. But it's nice to also know that when you get triggered, it doesn't mean you have to collapse, right? It doesn't mean like, oh, I'm over the edge of the river. You can still find your way back. Does that resonate for you?
Completely. I like to say when it's on you, it's on you. And if you know it's on you, if anger's on you, jealousy's on you, if fear is on you, if sadness is on you, okay, lean into that, breathe into that. Allow it, because that's the only way past is through it.
Right.
If you're resistant, you try to fight it, you're looking for some way out of it, you're squirming around, it's going to continue.
Resistant or denying, right? That's the other one, right? You're resisting or you're denying in some way, or blaming, right? Like all of a sudden, whatever's going on, then you're looking for someone else that is responsible. I'm looking for another responsible party. And I love the way, looking at the word responsibility, right? Like the ability to respond. Not, the concept, like inside the 15 commitments of conscious leadership, they talk about one of the things is be 100% responsible. And some people are like, well, other people contributed. And I'm like, okay, we're not necessarily saying that you're the only person who contributed, but if you're 100% responsible, it means you can respond regardless, right? Like under a car, you can respond, right? You could react, you could be, holy shit, and not be here today. Right? Or you can respond in whatever that challenge is and still find, your way back to peace, and which gives us choice, right? Yeah. Viktor Frankl talks about in logotherapy talks about the space between stimulus and responses where our freedom lies, right? Yes. Regardless of what's going on inside that space, we can choose who we are, how we show up.
I love
and the practices are so important because sometimes people, want to find this presence, but without the ongoing practice, it's like wanting to run a marathon, but not having trained. Yeah, that doesn't happen. You don't find presence in that moment when you're triggered if you haven't practiced finding presence.
Living in a state of constant mantra is not going to change your life.
Right.
And I love what you said, responsibility.
Right.
Responsibility. I have the responsibility to respond with ability.
Right.
And the practice of mindfulness and awareness and self-control, or self-regulation, better said, for me is a gateway into making scratching out for yards on that field.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do now is pivot a little bit, because we talked a little bit about some of the past, some of the present, what's going on. And what we also want to do is think about some of the things that are in your future. And I know you're both involved in several different business ventures and expansions of who you are and how you're showing up in the world. And so we'll start off with you, Kerry. You left the corporate world quite a while ago, and as have I been in several different business ventures and learned different skills and talents and capabilities. Tell me how having those experiences really helps you to show up to some of the challenges you find yourself with today.
Gosh, for me, it was in 2017, and it was a series. It was where I had gotten to the place where I was tired of self-sabotaging myself to underperform to the point where, so that I could make a change. Right. There was an unconscious pattern I was in of sabotaging myself and underperforming because I really didn't want to
sit there for a while. Cause I think that is sometimes people feel that they can't make a change unless their circumstances get so bad. And so what they end up doing is creating circumstances that are bad, that force the change. It's kind of, I'm a 31 year sober alcoholic. And so I can look back and everybody has different bottoms. And, I can romantically say my bottom wasn't that bad, though, I can also look at a lot of times that I was pretty drunk and got into some situations that weren't really great. But we all choose those bottoms, and we also choose them in our life, right? Like, what are we tolerating? And are we really paying attention to the opportunities that are calling us and, where we're being called? Or do we sometimes lacking the courage to step out on our own because we're choosing to wait for the circumstances to force it? And I think that was kind of what you're saying. Am I accurate in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think what's happening now is there's a convergence of my worthiness with the opportunities that I'm manifesting in my life. And that's a blossoming. That's a becoming on a level that, I never knew could be this powerful, or I'm starting to see how powerful this is. And at the time it was like, well, I knew I was misaligned.
Right.
I knew I was unhappy. I wanted to make the change, but I was attached to certain aspects of the false sense of security, the financial aspect of it, the status of it, everything else, whatever that was.
Right.
But I didn't feel worthy enough to say, no, I'm going to move into something that's more aligned with me. And I'm not, and my fear is overcome by my becoming.
Yeah, that's so cool. One of the things that, like, the name of the company, that my primary company is Courageous Authenticity. And so I named the company that 15 years ago. And the interesting thing is, it wasn't because I was courageously authentic. It was because I wasn't, and it was an aspirational value for me. It was an idea that I wanted to be courageous enough to show up as who I am, regardless of the environment, regardless of who was going to be accepting or not accepting. I wasn't there, but at my core, I knew that was something I wanted.
Yeah.
And so I, named it, and over time have been coming closer, and feel pretty good in that area. I feel like, I'm not that worried.
Hey, you're unapologetically weird, and I love it.
No doubt. I turned 60 this year. And so one of the sayings that really resonates with me now, and you guys may be familiar, there was like, when I was 18 years old, and this is so true for me. When I was 18 years old, I was so freaking concerned about what everybody thought about me. Like, it was consuming. As I moved on in life and I reached my 40s, I wasn't nearly so concerned. Now that I'm on my 60s, I realized nobody was thinking about me anyway. And I look back and you're like, wow, what an unbelievable waste of energy.
Oh my gosh.
Like, making up this story that you were some lead character in someone else's life, and you're just not.
But also, what a freedom.
Oh, it is wonderful. And so the thing you hope to be able to do is, like, maybe somebody listening is not going to wait till they're 60. Maybe they're not going to wait till they're 40. They're going to, decide, you know what? I'm going to step into myself in my 20s or my teens. They're look at a lot of these things and there's certain maturation that occurs. But at the end of the day, like, there's a lot of journey that I went on that, you know, who knows? You know, I love where I am. No worries about it. But you look at some of the ways that we've matured and you say, wow, that could have been cool, you know, to bring this back, you know, a few decades. And,
oh my gosh. Yeah. And well, youth is waste, you know, and what's they say, you know, youth is wasted on the young.
Yeah.
I mean, there's cliches because they point to truths, right? So, you know, forget the past, there's now. And, you know, you've got the injection mold of what you're becoming and, you know, fill it, flow into it. And if you don't fill it all the way to the top every time, you go to try to print it and keep filling it again. I don't know if that analogy sticks, but
yeah, no, totally. Yeah. The other, like, that's a filling one. The other one is the idea of the Statue of David. Are you guys familiar with the story about the Statue of David and Michelangelo?
No.
So anyway, Michelangelo was asked, like, 'cause the Statue of David is this monstrous 16-foot marble statue that is built out of a piece of marble. And so when people were speaking to Michelangelo about the Statue of David, they were asking, like, how in the world did you carve that into that stone? He said, I didn't. What I did is I extracted everything that wasn't David. Mm. And so often we think about, like, what do I need to add to myself in order to be acceptable to the world?
Yes.
Whereas if we really can get comfortable with who we are and think about how do I extract everything that's not really me, and just show up in the world and be you, because that's what you can do better than anyone else. Everybody else can be how they are, you know, but the only thing we can really offer that's the most valuable is our gifts, our talents, our passions, truly where they are, you know, not what someone else thinks they should be.
Oh,
right.
Oh,
so let's talk a little. So we talked a little bit about, you know, leaving the corporate world. And I know that one of the things that you're working on, Jodi, I understand, is really kind of expanding the way you use your leadership, which you've had kind of from the platform of a yoga teacher and that community, and thinking about how do you continue to expand that. Tell me a little more about what's going on there.
So we are in process of coming up with what do we call it? A spiritual platform.
I think it's like an inspirational platform disguised as a clothing company.
Yeah. We are really interested in kind of co-creating and facilitating changing the narrative. And when we say changing the narrative, if you turn on the television or the news, or you pick up a tabloid, you pick up, you know, People magazine, what is the narrative that you are automatically kind of drafting into? Now at this time and stage of, you know, human development, we have all these other forms of media and all these other platforms, and you're hearing all of these other messages and, you know, people's voices. And there are other narratives available that we believe is helping to just change the energy of the planet. And so we are incubating and starting to bring to life a company that is a clothing company that is, Kerry, why don't you go for it? Why don't you say this?
So as I said,
his baby.
I said at the beginning, like, you know, Jodi's working into her slot, into her power pocket inside of that conversation. But this is something that's been birthing inside of me. It's been gestating for 20 years. And this company is an inspirational platform that is going to invite people into a conversation and join communities that exist and create new ones that change the narrative of, you know, I'm not enough to I am fully empowered, and then I am not separate. Ultimately, you know, it's a conversation on raising consciousness. It's being part of the movement. It's being, you know, on that side of the conversation in the world to bring the power back to, you know, to connect back to our universal power, to source, and ultimately, you know, heal ourselves and our planet and create just a better way of life, a higher vibration, a higher frequency. And so we, you know, on a practical level, when you want to pull it into 3D, we have sayings that we've been amassing together inside of conversations we've been having, and the relationship exists inside of the conversation. My relationship to my higher power in myself, and is facilitated to a tremendous degree in the relationship I have with this amazing human being, and that's ended up in a lot of in one-liners that we're going to put onto clothing, specifically to start with some T-shirts,
podcast titles,
and podcasts and things you might look at and say,
you guys gonna invite me in?
Absolutely.
We'll flip the tables, right?
Absolutely.
Speaking of tables, this particular table is actually owned by someone else at this moment.
Oh my gosh.
So we're going to have to shut it down. But if you guys would be so kind, I'd love to have you back. I really have had fun with this.
Yeah.
And you have so much to offer. So if we can set up another time to continue, that would be grand.
Absolutely.
Anyway, thank you everybody for being a part of this. And again, this is Jodi and Kerry Perl, and we're excited to have them, and we want to continue the conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you inviting us.
My pleasure.
It's an honor. Thanks.